Colonel Sarah Hawkeye Martinez banked her A-10 Thunderbolt hard to the right, feeling the familiar rumble of the twin engines beneath her. The desert landscape of Afghanistan stretched endlessly below, a canvas of browns and grays that had become as familiar as her own backyard after 18 months of deployment. Her radio crackled with the urgent voice of ground control.
Hawkeye 7-7, we have troops in contact. Grid reference follows. The coordinates came through clean and precise. Sarah's fingers moved automatically across her instruments, plotting the location on her tactical display. Coalition forces were pinned down by enemy fire in a valley 12 kilometers southeast of her current position. Copy ground control. Hawkeye 7-7 is inbound, time on target 4 minutes.
Sarah pushed the throttles forward, feeling the A-10's massive GAU-8 cannon beneath her feet. This aircraft had been her home away from home for the better part of 2 years. Every rivet, every switch, every sound the machine made was burned into her memory. The tail number 810964 was painted in bold letters on her fuselage, though she rarely thought about it. To her, this wasn't just aircraft number 964. This was her bird, her weapon, her lifeline. The radio chattered with updates from the forward air controller on the ground. Hawkeye 7-7, be advised enemy forces are dug in along the ridgeline. Multiple RPG positions confirmed. Our boys are taking heavy fire from the north side of the valley. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning the terrain ahead. The valley appeared as a dark scar in the landscape, surrounded by rocky hills that provided perfect cover for insurgent fighters. She had done this dance dozens of times before. The A-10 was built for exactly this kind of work. Close air support. Protecting the grunts on the ground. Making sure American soldiers went home to their families. Ground control, Hawkeye 7-7 has visual on the valley. Beginning attack run. Sarah rolled the aircraft into a steep dive, lining up her approach. The heads-up display showed targeting information scrolling past her eyes. Distance to target, airspeed, angle of attack. Everything looked good for a strafing run with the 30mm cannon. The sound of the GAU-8 firing was unlike anything else in military aviation. A deep, thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. Sarah squeezed the trigger and watched the tracers arc down toward the enemy positions. The cannon shells were designed to penetrate armor, but they worked just as well against fortified infantry positions. Rock and dirt exploded in fountains along the ridgeline where the rounds impacted. Beautiful work, Hawkeye. You nailed them. The excitement in the ground controller's voice was clear. Sarah pulled up from her attack run and circled back around for another pass. This was why she flew. This moment when her skills and her aircraft could make the difference between life and death for soldiers on the ground. The second attack run went as smoothly as the first. More cannon fire, more explosions along the enemy positions. Sarah was lining up for a third pass when her radar warning receiver began screaming. The high-pitched tone meant only one thing. Someone had locked onto her aircraft with a surface-to-air missile system. Hawkeye 7-7, brake left. SAM launch detected. The warning came from an AWACS aircraft circling high above the battlefield. Sarah immediately threw her A-10 into a violent left turn, dumping chaff and flares to confuse any incoming missiles. The countermeasures streaked away from her aircraft like metallic fireworks. She held her breath for 10 seconds, waiting for an explosion that never came. Either the missile had missed, or her countermeasures had worked. Sarah leveled off and tried to spot the source of the missile launch. SAM sites were priority targets. Take them out, and every aircraft in the area would be safer. Ground control, do you have eyes on that SAM position? Sarah keyed her radio while scanning the hills below. Finding a mobile missile launcher in this terrain was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it had to be done. Negative, Hawkeye. We're still taking fire from multiple positions. Can you continue close air support? The ground troops were still pinned down. Sarah faced a difficult decision. Stay in the area and risk another missile launch, or withdraw and leave the soldiers without air cover. There was no real choice. Sarah had taken an oath to support and defend, and that included the men fighting on the ground below her. She set up for another attack run, this time varying her approach angle to make targeting more difficult for any remaining SAM operators. The third cannon run was interrupted by another radar warning. This time the tone was different, more urgent. Sarah looked at her threat display and felt ice water flood her veins.
multiple missile launches.
At least 3 SAMs were coming her way, and they were tracking perfectly despite her evasive maneuvers. Hawkeye 7-7, you have multiple inbound missiles.
Recommend immediate egress. The AWACS controller sounded genuinely worried now.
Sarah was in serious trouble, and everyone on the radio net knew it. Sarah pulled her A-10 into the steepest climb the aircraft could manage while dispensing every piece of chaff and every flare in her inventory. The countermeasures created a glittering cloud around her aircraft, but the missile warnings continued. At least 1 SAM was still tracking, still closing the distance.
The explosion, when it came, was not as dramatic as the movies would suggest.
Sarah felt a sharp jolt through the airframe, followed by warning lights blooming across her instrument panel like angry red flowers. Her left engine was on fire, hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly, and her flight controls felt mushy and unresponsive.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Hawkeye 7-7 has been hit. Left engine fire, losing hydraulics. Attempting emergency landing. Sarah's training took over even as adrenaline flooded her system. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Fly the airplane first, worry about everything else second.
The A-10 was famous for its ability to absorb damage and keep flying. The aircraft had been designed during the Cold War to survive in the intense air defense environment over Europe. Redundant systems, armored cockpit, engines mounted high to avoid ground fire. Sarah had heard stories of A-10s returning to base with massive battle damage, but she had never experienced it herself.
Her right engine was still running, though the aircraft was barely maintaining altitude. Sarah scanned the terrain below, looking for anywhere flat enough to attempt an emergency landing. The desert offered few options. Rocky hills, deep wadis, scattered vegetation. Nothing that looked remotely suitable for putting down a damaged aircraft. Hawkeye 7-7, we're vectoring rescue assets to your location. Can you make it to the forward operating base?
The AWACS controller was coordinating search and rescue efforts, but the nearest friendly airfield was 40 kilometers away. Sarah did some quick mental calculations and shook her head, even though no one could see her.
Negative, I'm losing altitude too fast. Going to have to put her down in the desert.
Sarah's voice remained calm and professional despite the circumstances. Panic would not help her survive the next few minutes. Focus and training were her only allies now. The ground was rushing up faster than she would have liked. Sarah aimed for what looked like a relatively flat section of desert floor, hoping the sandy soil would cushion her impact. The A-10's landing gear was already damaged, so this would be a belly landing. She would have one chance to get it right. Hawkeye 7-7, you are cleared for emergency landing. Rescue is inbound. The radio transmission was barely audible over the sound of rushing wind and failing engines. Sarah's damaged aircraft was creating its own symphony of mechanical distress. She pulled back on the stick, trying to flare the aircraft for landing while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid a stall. The A-10 hit the desert floor hard, harder than any training exercise had prepared her for. The impact threw her against her shoulder harnesses with tremendous force. Metal screamed against rock as the aircraft slid across the uneven terrain, carving a deep furrow in the sand. When the aircraft finally stopped moving, Sarah found herself hanging upside down in her ejection seat. The A-10 had flipped during the landing sequence, coming to rest on its back. Fuel was dripping from damaged tanks, and Sarah could smell aviation gas mixing with the smoke from her still-burning engine. Getting out of the inverted cockpit took every bit of strength she could muster. The ejection seat's harness release was sticky with hydraulic fluid, and her hands were shaking from the impact. Sarah finally managed to free herself and drop to what had been the cockpit ceiling, now the floor of her upside-down world. The canopy emergency release worked perfectly, just as it had been designed to do. Sarah crawled out of the wreckage and immediately put distance between herself and the aircraft. Fuel fires were unpredictable, and she had no desire to be caught in an explosion. The silence of the desert was profound after the noise of the damaged aircraft. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she took inventory of her situation. She was alive, apparently uninjured except for some bruises, and her survival radio was working. Rescue would be coming, but it might take hours to reach her location. Sarah looked back at her aircraft, tail number 810964 clearly visible even with the A-10 sitting upside down in the sand. The bird had brought her home one last time, sacrificing itself to save her life. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and loss looking at the wreckage. That aircraft had been her partner for 2 years of combat operations. Her survival radio crackled to life with the voice of a search and rescue coordinator.
Hawkeye 77, this is Pedro 71. We have your position and are inbound. Estimated time of arrival 45 minutes. Are you injured? Pedro 71, Hawkeye 77 is uninjured and secure.
Aircraft is a total loss, but pilot is ready for pickup. Sarah's military training kept her responses crisp and professional, but inside she was already beginning to process what had happened. She had been shot down. Her aircraft was destroyed. She was stranded in enemy territory with nothing but her sidearm and survival gear.
The next hour passed slowly.
Sarah established a defensive position behind a large boulder about 50 meters from her crashed aircraft, keeping her survival radio and her pistol close at hand.
The desert was eerily quiet except for the occasional crack of cooling metal from the wreckage.
She found herself thinking about the ground troops who had called for her support.
Had they made it out of the valley safely? Had her attack runs bought them enough time to escape or call in artillery support?
These were questions that would probably never be answered, but they mattered to her.
Every mission mattered. Every sortie was personal.
The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. Pedro 71 appeared as a dot on the horizon, growing larger as it approached her position. The HH-60 Pave Hawk looked like salvation with its distinctive profile and rescue markings. The helicopter landing kicked up a tremendous dust cloud, but Sarah was already moving toward it before the aircraft had fully touched down.
The rescue crew chief waved her aboard with practiced efficiency.
Within minutes, she was strapped into the helicopter and climbing away from the crash site.
Welcome aboard, Colonel. Good to see you in one piece.
The crew chief had to shout over the noise of the rotors, but his smile was genuine.
Sarah managed a tired smile in return. She was alive, and that was more than many pilots could say after being shot down in enemy territory.
As the rescue helicopter banked toward the nearest coalition base, Sarah caught one last glimpse of her aircraft sitting broken in the desert sand. Tail number 810964 would never fly again, but it had completed its final mission successfully. It had brought its pilot home alive. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to decompress and begin processing the events of the day. She had been shot down, crashed in the desert, and rescued without serious injury. By any measure, it had been a very good day despite the loss of her aircraft.
Many pilots were not so fortunate.
But, as the helicopter approached the airfield, Sarah began to think about what came next. She was a pilot without an aircraft, a warrior temporarily without her weapon. The Air Force would eventually assign her to a new A-10, but it would take time. Aircraft were precious resources in a combat zone, and every day spent waiting was another day when ground troops might need close air support that she could not provide. The helicopter touched down on the landing pad at Bagram Air Base, and Sarah climbed out into the familiar organized chaos of a forward operating base. Vehicles moving in all directions, aircraft taking off and landing, personnel hurrying between buildings on various missions. This was home, at least temporarily. Her squadron commander was waiting for her as she walked away from the helicopter. Colonel Jack Bulldog Henderson had been her boss for the entire deployment, and she could read the relief on his face as she approached. Losing a pilot was every commander's worst nightmare.
Damn good to see you walking, Sarah. How are you feeling? Henderson's greeting was characteristically direct.
He was a no-nonsense officer who had flown combat missions himself and understood exactly what she had been through.
I'm fine, sir. Just sorry about the aircraft. Sarah's response was automatic, but she meant it.
Every pilot hated losing an aircraft, even when there was no alternative. The A-10 represented millions of dollars in taxpayer money and years of training and maintenance.
Don't worry about the bird. We can always get more aircraft. Pilots like you are irreplaceable.
Henderson's words carried the weight of experience. He had been flying military aircraft for over 20 years and had seen too many good pilots lost to enemy action or accidents. The intelligence debriefing took several hours. Sarah had to describe every detail of her mission, from the initial ground support request to the moment she climbed aboard the rescue helicopter. Intelligence officers were particularly interested in the surface-to-air missile sites that had shot her down. Any information about enemy capabilities was valuable for planning future missions.
By the time the debrief was complete, word of Sarah's shootdown had spread throughout the squadron.
Fellow pilots stopped by to check on her, sharing their own close call stories and offering encouragement.
The camaraderie of combat aviation was unlike anything in civilian life.
These people understood exactly what she had experienced because they faced the same risks every time they strapped on an aircraft. That evening, Sarah found herself standing outside the squadron operations building, looking up at the stars over Afghanistan. The same stars that had watched over her crashed aircraft in the desert a few hours earlier.
Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and, eventually, a new aircraft.
But, tonight, she was content to be alive and surrounded by the people who shared her dangerous profession. She thought about tail number 810964 one more time before heading to her quarters. That aircraft had been her partner, her protection, and, ultimately, her salvation. In the morning, she would begin the process of bonding with a new A-10, but she would never forget the bird that had sacrificed itself to bring her home. 3 weeks after the crash, Sarah found herself assigned to a replacement A-10 with tail number 78-0684. The aircraft was older than her previous bird, with more flight hours and a few more patches on its titanium bathtub armor around the cockpit. But it was airworthy and ready for combat, which was all that mattered in a war zone. The new aircraft felt different under her hands. Every A-10 had its own personality, its own quirks and characteristics that a pilot had to learn and adapt to.
Some pulled slightly left during takeoff.
Others had hydraulic systems that responded a fraction of a second slower than normal. These were not defects, just the accumulated wear and individual variations that came with military aircraft that had been in service for decades.
Sarah's first mission in the new bird was a routine patrol along the Pakistan border.
No enemy contact expected, just a presence mission to remind anyone watching that coalition air power was always nearby. She found herself thinking about her old aircraft during the long transit to the patrol area. It felt strange to be flying a different tail number after so many months of partnership with 810964.
Hawkeye 77, this is Overlord. We have a priority mission for you. New coordinates coming up on tactical frequency.
The transmission from Air Operations Center interrupted her thoughts. Sarah switched radio frequencies and copied down the new mission details.
Coalition forces were taking sporadic sniper fire near a village in Helmand province.
They needed an A-10 to conduct a show of force, hopefully convincing the snipers to withdraw without requiring actual weapons engagement. Show of force missions were an art form in themselves.
The goal was to demonstrate overwhelming firepower without actually using it.
A low, fast pass by an A-10 usually convinced enemy fighters that discretion was the better part of valor. The sound of the twin turbofan engines and the sight of weapons hanging from the aircraft's wing pylons sent a clear message about what could happen if hostilities escalated.
Sarah banked toward the new coordinates while checking her weapons systems.
Even though this was supposed to be a non-kinetic mission, she wanted to be ready if the situation changed. The A-10 carried a full load of 30mm cannon ammunition and several Maverick missiles. Enough firepower to handle most ground targets if the tactical situation deteriorated. The village appeared ahead as a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by irrigated fields. Sarah could see coalition vehicles positioned on the high ground overlooking the settlement, but no obvious signs of enemy activity. Snipers were notoriously difficult to spot from the air, especially when they were using concealed positions inside buildings or natural terrain features. Overlord, Hawkeye 77 has visual on the target area. Beginning show of force pass. Sarah descended to 500 feet above ground level and accelerated to maximum speed. The A-10 was not a fast aircraft by fighter standards, but at low altitude the combination of engine noise and visual impact was impressive. The first pass took her directly over the village at just under 400 knots. Sarah pulled up sharply at the end of the run, using the A-10's excellent low-speed handling to transition into a tight climbing turn. Anyone on the ground would have gotten a very clear look at the weapons she was carrying. Good pass, Hawkeye. Stand by for damage assessment. The ground forces were using optics to observe the village, looking for any signs that the show of force had achieved its intended effect. Sometimes a single low pass was enough to end a sniper engagement. Other times, it took multiple passes or actual weapons employment to solve the problem. Sarah established a racetrack pattern overhead while waiting for instructions. The village looked peaceful from 5,000 feet, with no obvious military activity visible. Somewhere down there, enemy snipers were probably discussing whether to continue their harassment of coalition forces or withdraw to fight another day. Hawkeye 7-7, we're getting reports of sniper movement in the village. Looks like your show of force is working. Stand by for further instructions. The good news meant that Sarah's intimidation tactics were having the desired effect. No weapons would need to be employed, and no one would die today if the snipers had enough sense to leave the area. While orbiting overhead, Sarah's radio picked up transmissions from another aircraft in the area. An F-16 flight call signed Viper 2-1 was conducting combat air patrol about 50 kilometers to the east. The F-16s were there to provide air-to-air protection for the A-10s and other aircraft operating in the region. Viper 2-1, this is Hawkeye 7-7. How copy? Sarah decided to check in with the fighter pilots. Inter-service cooperation was essential in a complex battle space, and maintaining communication between different aircraft types was always a good idea. Hawkeye 7-7, Viper 2-1 reads you 5x5. We've got you on radar conducting CAS operations. Let us know if you need any assistance. The F-16 pilot's response was professional and friendly. Fighter pilots and attack pilots had different jobs, but they all wore the same uniform and faced the same threats. Roger, Viper. Just conducting show of force at this time. Appreciate the air cover. Sarah appreciated knowing that fighters were nearby if the situation became more complex. Air-to-air threats were rare in Afghanistan, but surface-to-air missiles were always a concern. Hawkeye 7-7, this is Overlord. Reports indicate sniper activity has ceased. You are cleared to return to base when ready. The mission was complete without a shot being fired. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction at achieving the objective through intimidation rather than destruction. Overlord, Hawkeye 7-7 copies. Returning to base. Sarah began the long transit back to Bagram, climbing to cruise altitude for better fuel efficiency. The new aircraft performed flawlessly during the climb, but it still felt foreign compared to her old bird. The flight home gave her time to think about the nature of air power in counterinsurgency warfare. Most missions were like today's patrol, long hours of boredom punctuated by brief moments of intensity. Success was often measured by what didn't happen rather than what did. Villages not attacked, convoys not ambushed, soldiers not killed by sniper fire. Back at base, Sarah went through the standard post-flight procedures. Debriefing with intelligence officers, maintenance inspection of the aircraft, and updating her personal flight records. The routine was comforting after the stress of adapting to a new aircraft and new mission requirements. That evening, she was sitting in the squadron-ready room when a young maintenance sergeant approached her with a clipboard and a serious expression. Tech Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was one of the best crew chiefs in the squadron, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to keep aircraft flying under the most challenging conditions. Ma'am, I've got some paperwork here about your old bird, tail number 810964. Thought you might want to see this. Rodriguez handed her a maintenance report with several official stamps and signatures. Sarah read through the technical language, trying to understand what the document was telling her. According to the report, a recovery team had reached her crashed aircraft and conducted a detailed examination of the wreckage. The missile damage was extensive, but the investigators had been able to determine exactly what had happened during her emergency landing. The findings were both illuminating and disturbing. The surface-to-air missile had detonated close enough to cause significant fragmentation damage to the left engine and surrounding structure. But what caught Sarah's attention was a note about additional damage that had not been caused by the missile strike. Several of the aircraft's critical systems had been hit by small arms fired during her low-level attack runs. Sergeant, this says my bird took multiple hits from ground fire before the missile strike. I never knew I was taking that much damage. Sarah looked up from the report with newfound respect for her old aircraft. The A-10 had been absorbing enemy fire and continuing to function right up until the moment the missiles hit. Yes, ma'am. The investigators found bullet holes in the hydraulic lines, the electrical systems, even the armor around the cockpit. That aircraft was shot to pieces, but it kept flying long enough to get you out of the immediate threat area. Rodriguez's explanation helped Sarah understand just how close she had come to disaster. The titanium bathtub that surrounded the A-10's cockpit had done its job perfectly. Several rounds had struck the armored enclosure, but none had penetrated into the cockpit space. Without that protection, Sarah would never have survived long enough to attempt an emergency landing.
There's something else, ma'am.
The investigators want to recover some components from the wreckage for analysis.
Seems like the enemy was using some new type of ammunition that we haven't seen before.
Your aircraft might help us understand what we're up against. Rodriguez's comment highlighted the fact that warfare was constantly evolving, with both sides adapting their tactics and equipment. Sarah handed the report back to the sergeant, but her mind was still processing the implications. Her aircraft had been under fire for several minutes before the missile strike, taking hit after hit while continuing to provide close air support to the ground troops. The bird had literally been dying around her while she focused on the mission.
The next morning brought a new mission assignment.
Sarah would be leading a two-ship formation of A-10s on a complex close air support mission in a particularly dangerous area of Kandahar province.
Intelligence reports indicated heavy enemy activity, including multiple surface-to-air missile sites. Her wingman was a young captain named Dave Rook Thompson, flying his first combat deployment.
Thompson was an excellent pilot, but he lacked the experience that came from months of flying in a combat environment.
Sarah would need to keep a close eye on him during the mission. Rook, remember what we discussed in the briefing.
Stay high until I call you down for an attack run, and keep your eyes open for missile launches. This is Indian country, and the bad guys have been getting better at their jobs.
Sarah's pre-flight instructions were delivered with the authority of experience. Copy, Hawkeye.
I'll stay in formation and follow your lead.
Thompson's response showed the appropriate respect for his flight leader's experience, but Sarah could hear the excitement in his voice. Young pilots were always eager to prove themselves in combat.
The flight to the target area was uneventful, giving Sarah time to study the terrain and plan their attack profiles. The enemy forces were reportedly dug in along a series of ridges overlooking a major supply route. Coalition convoys had been taking increasing amounts of fire from this area, and ground forces were requesting airstrikes to clear the threat.
Hawkeye Flight, this is Overlord. Target area is hot with multiple enemy positions confirmed.
You are cleared for immediate close air support. The transmission from the Air Operations Center indicated that this would be a kinetic mission.
Sarah would be employing weapons today, unlike yesterday's show of force. Overlord, Hawkeye Flight copies. Beginning attack sequence.
Sarah led Thompson into a wide orbit around the target area while studying the terrain below. She could see muzzle flashes from several locations along the ridgeline, indicating active enemy positions.
The first attack run went smoothly.
Sarah dove on a suspected machine gun position and delivered a burst of 30mm cannon fire that silenced the threat immediately. Thompson followed her lead with a textbook attack on a second position, demonstrating the skills he had learned during training. But, as they pulled up from their attack runs, Sarah's radar warning receiver began its familiar high-pitched scream. Someone had locked onto her aircraft with a surface-to-air missile system. The sound triggered immediate memories of her previous shootdown, but she forced herself to focus on the tactical situation.
Rook, brake left. SAM launch detected.
Sarah's warning came just as a missile streaked up from a concealed position in the hills. The white smoke trail was clearly visible against the brown landscape, tracking directly toward Thompson's aircraft. The young pilot reacted exactly as he had been trained, throwing his A-10 into a violent evasive maneuver while dispensing chaff and flares. But the missile was tracking perfectly, closing the distance despite Thompson's defensive actions.
Sarah watched in horror as the surface-to-air missile detonated just behind Thompson's aircraft.
The explosion was close enough to cause visible damage to his tail section, and she could see debris falling away from his A-10 as it struggled to maintain altitude.
Rook, what's your status? I see damage to your tail section.
Sarah's radio call was urgent but controlled. This was exactly the situation that every flight leader dreaded, having a wingman hit by enemy fire. Hawkeye, I've got multiple warning lights and my controls are very sluggish. I think I lost part of my vertical stabilizer in that explosion. Thompson's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the stress underneath his professional demeanor.
Sarah maneuvered to get a visual assessment of Thompson's aircraft.
The damage was worse than she had initially thought. Most of his vertical stabilizer was gone, along with significant portions of his horizontal stabilizer. The A-10 was still flying, but it was badly wounded. Rook, you need to head for base immediately.
I'll escort you and coordinate with search and rescue. Sarah's decision was immediate and non-negotiable.
A damaged aircraft needed to get on the ground as soon as possible, before the damage got worse or additional systems failed.
The flight back to base was tense. Thompson's aircraft was barely controllable, requiring constant attention to maintain level flight.
Sarah flew close formation with him, ready to provide assistance or call for rescue if he was forced to eject.
Hawkeye Flight, this is Pedro 7-1.
We have your position and are standing by for possible rescue operations. The search and rescue coordinator was already airborne and monitoring their progress. If Thompson had to eject, help would be available immediately. Fortunately, Thompson managed to keep his damaged A-10 in the air long enough to reach Bagram Air Base. The emergency landing was harrowing to watch, but he managed to get the aircraft on the ground without further incident. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief as she watched him taxi clear of the runway. That evening, Sarah found herself in the maintenance hangar looking at Thompson's damaged aircraft. The young pilot was standing beside her, both of them studying the extent of the battle damage. Most of the tail section would need to be replaced, but the aircraft could be repaired and returned to service. You did good work today, Rook. Keeping that bird in the air with that much damage took real skill.
Sarah's compliment was sincere.
Thompson had demonstrated the kind of airmanship that separated good pilots from average ones.
Thanks, Hawkeye.
I kept thinking about what you said during the briefing about staying calm and flying the airplane.
The training really does kick in when things go bad. Thompson's response showed the maturity that came from surviving his first real emergency in combat.
Sarah nodded, remembering her own recent experience with battle damage and emergency landings. Every pilot hoped to complete their combat tour without incident, but the reality was that flying in a war zone involved unavoidable risks. The best you could do was train hard, fly smart, and take care of your wingman. 6 months had passed since Thompson's close call, and the squadron had settled into the rhythm of sustained combat operations. Sarah was now the most experienced A-10 pilot in the unit, having completed over 200 combat missions. Her expertise was sought after by younger pilots, and she found herself mentoring a steady stream of new arrivals who were facing combat for the first time. The war had changed during her deployment. Enemy tactics were evolving, becoming more sophisticated and deadly. Surface-to-air missiles were appearing in areas where they had never been seen before.
Small arms fire was more accurate and better coordinated.
The insurgents were learning from their mistakes and adapting their methods to counter coalition air power. Sarah's new aircraft, tail number 78-0684, had proven to be a reliable partner. The older A-10 lacked some of the upgraded systems of her previous bird, but it had its own character and capabilities. More importantly, it had brought her home safely from dozens of dangerous missions over the past 6 months.
On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for what intelligence described as a high-risk mission deep in Taliban territory. Coalition Special Operations Forces were conducting a raid on a suspected bomb-making facility, and they needed close air support from aircraft that could loiter in the area for hours if necessary. Listen up, people. This is going to be a long one. Colonel Henderson addressed the mission briefing with his usual directness. The ground pounders are going after a major IED facility. Intelligence indicates heavy resistance and possible man-portable air defense systems in the area. The mission briefing included detailed photographs of the target area, showing a compound surrounded by rough terrain that would provide excellent cover for defending forces. Escape routes led in multiple directions, and the whole area was known to be heavily mined with improvised explosive devices. Sarah studied the photos while listening to the intelligence briefing. The compound looked like a fortress, with high walls and multiple buildings that could hide enemy fighters. Getting close enough to provide effective support would require flying into a heavily defended area where every rooftop could conceal a missile launcher. Her wingman for this mission was Major Lisa Venom Chang, an experienced pilot who had recently transferred from another squadron. Chang had a reputation for aggressive flying and precise weapons delivery, exactly the kind of pilot Sarah wanted beside her on a mission like this. Venom, what do you think about using the northern approach for our initial orbit? Sarah asked during the tactical planning portion of the briefing. The northern route would keep them away from known anti-aircraft positions, but it would also limit their ability to respond quickly if the ground troops needed immediate support. I like it. We can set up a racetrack pattern and stay high until they need us down low. Better to come in fast from altitude than to get caught in a crossfire at low level. Chang's response showed the kind of tactical thinking that Sarah appreciated in a wingman. The flight to the target area took almost an hour,
crossing some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. Sarah's radar warning receiver chirped occasionally as various ground-based radar systems painted her aircraft, but none of the contacts appeared to be missile threats.
At least not yet. Overlord, Hawkeye Flight is on station and ready for tasking. Sarah's check-in call was answered immediately by the Special Operations Ground Controller who was managing the raid.
Unlike regular Army units, Special Ops teams had their own dedicated air controllers who understood the unique requirements of sensitive missions.
Hawkeye Flight, this is Chaos 6. Our team is beginning movement to the target. Stay high and keep your eyes open. We'll call for fires if needed.
The Special Operations Controller used minimal radio traffic, knowing that enemy forces might be monitoring coalition frequencies. Sarah established an orbit pattern at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most small arms fire but low enough to respond quickly if the ground troops encountered resistance. Through her targeting pod, she could see the Special Operations team moving carefully toward the compound. The raid began with a coordinated assault on multiple buildings. Sarah watched through her sensors as the Special Operations troops breached the compound walls and began clearing structures room by room. Everything appeared to be going according to plan until her radio exploded with urgent transmissions. Chaos 6 is taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We need immediate close air support. The ground controller's voice was tight with stress. Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from several buildings as enemy fighters engaged the raiding party. Chaos 6, Hawkeye Flight is inbound with immediate support. Mark your positions with IR strobes. Sarah rolled into a steep dive while Chang followed in trail formation. Time was critical when ground troops were under fire. Every second of delay could mean American casualties. Sarah's first strafing run silenced an enemy position on the compound's main building, but return fire was intense. Tracers streaked past her aircraft as she pulled up from the attack. The enemy had been waiting for this raid, and they were prepared to fight back. Hawkeye, be advised we have multiple SA-7 launches. The warning from an orbiting surveillance aircraft came just as Sarah's missile warning system activated. At least 2 shoulder-fired missiles were tracking her aircraft as she climbed away from the target area. Sarah immediately began defensive maneuvering while dispensing chaff and flares. The missiles were old Soviet-era weapons, but they were still deadly if they found their mark. She felt the familiar ice-water sensation as she waited to see if her countermeasures would work. The first missile lost track and exploded harmlessly several hundred meters away. The second missile continued tracking, forcing Sarah into increasingly violent evasive maneuvers. Chang was calling out the missile's position while engaging enemy forces with her own weapons. The explosion, when it came, was different from anything Sarah had experienced before. Instead of the sharp crack of a proximity-fused warhead, this felt like a massive hammer blow to her aircraft. The surface-to-air missile had scored a direct hit on her left engine, and the A-10 was coming apart around her. Warning lights illuminated her instrument panel like a Christmas tree. Fire warnings, hydraulic failures, electrical problems. Her left engine was completely gone, torn away by the missile impact. Her right engine was running, but barely producing enough thrust to maintain altitude. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Hawkeye 7-7 has been hit. Direct missile strike, left engine destroyed. Aircraft is barely controllable. Sarah's emergency call was answered immediately by multiple aircraft. Everyone on the radio net understood the implications of an A-10 being shot down in this area. Hawkeye 7-7, this is Pedro 7-1. We're launching search and rescue immediately. Can you maintain altitude? The rescue coordinator was already coordinating assets, but Sarah knew that help was at least 30 minutes away. She would have to survive that long in a critically damaged aircraft. Pedro, I'm losing altitude steadily. Not sure how long I can keep her in the air. Sarah's response was honest but controlled. Panic would not help her situation. She needed to focus on flying the aircraft and finding a place to land or eject safely. Chang had moved into close formation with Sarah's damaged aircraft, providing a visual assessment of the damage while continuing to engage enemy ground forces. The tactical situation on the ground was deteriorating rapidly, with the Special Operations team still under heavy fire. Sarah, your entire left side is gone. I can see daylight through the fuselage. You need to get out of there now. Chang's assessment was delivered with the brutal honesty of a combat pilot. The aircraft was dying, and everyone knew it. But Sarah was not ready to abandon her aircraft yet. The A-10 was famous for its ability to survive massive damage and continue flying. She still had some control, and her right engine was still producing power. More importantly, the Special Operations team was still trapped in the compound below. Chaos 6, what's your status? Do you still need air support? Sarah's radio call was answered immediately by the embattled ground controller. The Special Operations team was pinned down and taking casualties. They needed her weapons, even if her aircraft was falling apart. Hawkeye, we're trapped in Building 3 with wounded. Enemy forces have us surrounded. We need gun runs on the north and east sides of the compound. The ground controller's request was clear. The troops needed covering fire to evacuate their wounded and escape the compound. Sarah looked at her weapons display. She still had ammunition for the 30mm cannon, and the gun system was independent of many of the aircraft systems that had been damaged by the missile strike. She could make one more attack run before the aircraft became unflyable. Chang, I'm going in for one more gun run. Cover me and be ready to call off the rescue birds if this goes bad. Sarah's decision was met with silence on the radio. Every pilot understood the implications of what she was planning. The final attack run was the most difficult flying Sarah had ever done. The damaged aircraft responded sluggishly to her control inputs, and the asymmetric thrust from her remaining engine made it difficult to maintain heading. But the 30mm cannon worked perfectly, raking the enemy positions with devastating fire. Sarah's gun run broke the enemy's resistance and allowed the Special Operations team to begin their withdrawal from the compound. But the effort had cost her aircraft its remaining margin of safety. The right engine was beginning to overheat, and her hydraulic systems were failing completely. All aircraft, Hawkeye 77 is going down. I'm ejecting in 30 seconds. Sarah's transmission was calm and professional, but everyone listening understood that they were about to watch a fellow pilot risk everything to save American lives on the ground. The ejection sequence worked exactly as designed. Sarah felt the tremendous upward acceleration as the rocket-powered seat carried her clear of the disintegrating aircraft. The parachute opened automatically, and suddenly, the noise and chaos of combat was replaced by the relative silence of her descent toward the rocky terrain below. Her aircraft, tail number 78-0684, continued flying for several more seconds before impacting the mountainside in a spectacular fireball. The explosion could be seen for miles, marking the final resting place of another A-10 that had given its life to protect American ground forces. Sarah landed hard in a boulder field about 2 kilometers from the compound where the Special Operations team was fighting for their lives. Her survival radio was working, and she could hear the coordination efforts for her rescue. But she was deep in enemy territory, and it would take time for help to reach her. Pedro 7-1, Hawkeye 7-7 is on the ground and secure. No injuries, good radio contact. Sarah's survival radio transmission was the best news the rescue coordinator had heard all day. She was alive and, apparently uninjured, which improved her chances of successful recovery dramatically. The next hour was the longest of Sarah's military career. She established a defensive position in the rocks while listening to radio traffic from the ongoing rescue operation. The Special Operations team had successfully evacuated from the compound, but they were still under fire from pursuing enemy forces. Chang orbited overhead in her A-10, providing what protection she could while coordinating the various rescue assets. F-16 fighters had been scrambled to provide additional air cover, and a full search and rescue package was en route to Sarah's location. The sound of approaching helicopters was eventually drowned out by the noise of additional airstrikes as coalition forces worked to suppress enemy activity in the area. Sarah's shootdown had triggered a massive response, with every available aircraft being committed to ensure her safe recovery. The rescue helicopter appeared through the smoke and dust of the ongoing battle, its crew chief already preparing to extract Sarah from her hiding place. The HH-60 Pave Hawk touched down just long enough for her to climb aboard before lifting off and heading for the safety of coalition airspace. As the rescue helicopter climbed away from the landing zone, Sarah caught a glimpse of the burning wreckage of her aircraft scattered across the mountainside. Another A-10 had been lost, but the mission had been successful. The Special Operations team had completed their raid and escaped without casualties, thanks in part to the close air support she had provided. Back at base, the intelligence debriefing revealed that the raid had been a major success. The bomb-making facility had been destroyed, along with a significant cache of weapons and explosives. Several high-value targets had been captured, providing valuable intelligence about enemy operations in the region. But, for Sarah, the most important outcome was that every American had returned home alive. The Special Operations Team, her wingman, and even herself had survived a mission that could easily have ended in tragedy.
That was what mattered most in the unforgiving arithmetic of combat aviation.
2 years later, Sarah found herself back in the United States, assigned to the 355th Fighter Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The transition from combat operations to peacetime training had been difficult, as it always was for pilots returning from deployment. The intensity and purpose of wartime flying was hard to replicate in a training environment. She was now a lieutenant colonel, having been promoted based on her exceptional combat record and leadership abilities. Her new job involved training the next generation of A-10 pilots, passing on the hard-earned lessons of combat to young aviators who would soon face their own deployments to dangerous places around the world. The morning briefing room at Davis-Monthan was filled with eager young faces, most of them fresh from pilot training and excited about learning to fly the A-10 Thunderbolt. Sarah looked at them and saw herself from 5 years earlier, full of confidence and enthusiasm but lacking the sobering experience that only combat could provide. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Advanced A-10 Training. Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn everything you need to know about close air support, battlefield interdiction, and combat search and rescue.
Sarah's introduction was professional but warm.
These young pilots deserved the best training she could provide. Among the students was a young first lieutenant named Jennifer Flash Williams, whose enthusiasm reminded Sarah of herself during her early flying career.
Williams asked detailed questions about combat tactics and weapons employment, clearly eager to excel in her training and eventually deploy with an operational squadron.
Ma'am, I've read about the A-10's survivability in combat, but what's it really like to take battle damage and keep flying? Williams' question brought back vivid memories of Sarah's 2 shootdowns and the aircraft that had sacrificed themselves to bring her home safely. Lieutenant, the A-10 is the most survivable aircraft ever built for close air support. But survivability isn't just about the airplane. It's about training, tactics, and the decisions you make under fire.
Sarah's response was measured and thoughtful.
She wanted to convey the seriousness of combat without discouraging the young pilot's enthusiasm. The training syllabus included intensive instruction on threat recognition, defensive tactics, and emergency procedures. Sarah drew heavily on her combat experience to make the lessons realistic and relevant. She told stories about real missions, real threats, and real consequences of poor decision-making in combat. One afternoon, while reviewing student progress with the squadron commander, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Rick Hammer Morrison, a young F-16 pilot stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I got your number from Colonel Henderson.
I'm calling about something that happened during my deployment to Afghanistan last year."
Morrison's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure how to proceed with the conversation.
"Go ahead, Captain. What can I do for you?" Sarah was intrigued by the call.
She had lost touch with most of the people from her deployment, and it was unusual for an F-16 pilot to contact her directly. "Ma'am, my wingman and I were flying combat air patrol when we got called in to provide top cover for a rescue operation. An A-10 pilot had been shot down, and we were tasked with keeping enemy fighters away from the rescue helicopters." Morrison paused, as if gathering his thoughts.
Sarah's interest was immediately piqued.
She had been rescued twice during her deployment, and both times F-16s had provided air cover during the operations. But she had never had direct contact with the fighter pilots who had protected her rescue. "The thing is, ma'am, when we arrived at the crash site, we saw the tail number of the downed A-10.
It was 810964.
When we got back to base, someone told us that number belonged to an aircraft that had been in service since the 1980s. It had flown combat missions in the Gulf War, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Morrison was talking about her first aircraft, the bird that had been destroyed during her initial shootdown. She had never learned the full history of that particular A-10, but now she was beginning to understand why the F-16 pilot was calling her.
"Captain, that was my aircraft.
I was the pilot who was shot down that day."
"But why are you telling me this now?"
Sarah's question was direct, but her voice carried genuine curiosity about where this conversation was leading.
"Ma'am, that's what I'm calling about.
After we got back to the States, my wingman started doing research on that tail number. What he found was pretty amazing, and we thought you should know about it. Morrison's voice carried a note of excitement now, as if he was about to share something significant. Over the next 20 minutes, Morrison told Sarah a story that she had never heard before. Tail number 810964 had indeed been in service since the early 1980s, but its service record was far more distinguished than most aircraft. The bird had flown over 3,000 combat missions across 4 different wars without losing a single pilot.
The aircraft was originally assigned to the 23rd Fighter Group during the Gulf War.
It flew 37 combat missions in 1991 without taking a single hit. Then, it was transferred to Europe for operations over Bosnia, where it flew another 48 missions.
Morrison was reading from notes, clearly having researched the aircraft's history in detail.
The list continued through operations in Iraq, where the aircraft had flown over 200 missions between 2003 and 2009. It had taken battle damage on multiple occasions but had always brought its pilot home safely. The maintenance records showed repairs for everything from small arms fire to shrapnel damage from surface-to-air missiles. Ma'am, according to the records, your aircraft saved the lives of 11 different pilots over its service career. You were the last pilot to fly that bird, and it gave its life to save yours just like it had done for so many others. Morrison's words carried a weight that Sarah had not expected. The revelation hit Sarah harder than she had anticipated.
Her aircraft had not just been another A-10 in the inventory.
It had been a guardian angel, protecting pilot after pilot through decades of combat operations. The bird that had sacrificed itself to save her life had been doing the same thing for other pilots since before she had even joined the Air Force.
Captain, thank you for telling me this. I had no idea about the aircraft's history. Is there any way I can get a copy of those records? Sarah's request was immediate and heartfelt.
She needed to know more about the aircraft that had been her partner during those final months of her deployment.
Absolutely, ma'am. I'll email you everything we found. But there's one more thing. My wingman and I would like to meet you in person if that's possible.
We've never met an A-10 pilot who had been shot down, and we'd like to hear the story from your perspective. The meeting was arranged for the following weekend at a restaurant near Luke Air Force Base.
Sarah drove to Phoenix with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension.
She had never talked extensively about her combat experiences with fighter pilots, and she wasn't sure what to expect from the encounter. Morrison and his wingman, Captain Dave Razor Jackson, turned out to be thoughtful young officers who were genuinely interested in learning about close air support operations. They asked detailed questions about A-10 tactics, weapons employment, and the unique challenges of flying low and slow in a threat environment.
Ma'am, we've always wondered what it's like to fly that close to the ground with people shooting at you.
F-16 stay high and fast. The idea of doing gun runs at 500 feet is pretty intimidating. Jackson's comment reflected the different worlds that fighter pilots and attack pilots lived in. Sarah found herself telling stories about her combat missions, including the details of both shootdowns and the remarkable performance of the aircraft that had saved her life.
Morrison and Jackson listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific tactics or procedures.
The thing that amazes me is how calm you sound when you talk about being shot down.
I think I would have been terrified.
Morrison's observation prompted Sarah to reflect on the nature of combat flying and how pilots learn to manage fear and stress.
Captain, fear is always there.
The trick is channeling it into focus and decision-making. The A-10 community has a saying, trust your training, trust your aircraft, and trust your wingman. When all three of those elements come together, you can accomplish the mission even under the worst circumstances. The conversation continued for several hours, covering everything from specific weapon systems to the psychological challenges of combat aviation. Sarah found herself enjoying the opportunity to share her experiences with pilots who understood the technical aspects of military flying. As the evening wound down, Morrison presented Sarah with a gift that took her completely by surprise. It was a framed photograph of her crashed A-10, taken by the recovery team that had reached the wreckage site. The image showed tail number 810964 clearly visible on the inverted aircraft, surrounded by the rocky terrain where she had made her emergency landing.
We thought you might want this as a reminder of the bird that brought you home.
According to the maintenance records, that aircraft saved 12 lives during its career, counting yours. Morrison's words carried a solemnity that reflected the significance of what the photograph represented. Sarah studied the image for a long moment, remembering the crash landing and the hours she had spent waiting for rescue in the Afghan desert. The aircraft looked broken and defeated in the photograph, but she knew that it had completed its final mission successfully.
It had brought her home.
Back at Davis Monthan the following week, Sarah found herself incorporating the story of tail number 810964 into her training lectures.
The young pilots were fascinated by the aircraft's history and the legacy of sacrifice that it represented.
The story became a powerful illustration of the bond between pilot and aircraft that was central to military aviation. Lieutenant Williams approached Sarah after one of these lectures with a question that demonstrated the impact the story was having on the students.
"Ma'am, do you think our aircraft have their own personalities? I mean, beyond just the mechanical differences between individual birds?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding.
"Lieutenant, I think every aircraft reflects the spirit of the pilots who have flown it and the missions it has completed.
Some birds are lucky. Some are unlucky. Some are survivors.
The key is to respect your aircraft and understand that it's your partner, not just a machine." The training program continued through the Arizona summer, with Sarah's students progressing from basic aircraft handling to complex combat scenarios. Each lesson was informed by her combat experience and the lessons learned from pilots who had flown before her. The legacy of aircraft like tail number 810964 lived on through the training she provided to the next generation. On the final day of the training program, Sarah stood before her graduating students with a sense of pride and accomplishment. These young pilots were ready to deploy with operational squadrons, carrying forward the traditions and expertise of the A-10 community. They would face their own challenges and write their own stories in whatever conflicts lay ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are now qualified A-10 pilots. But becoming a pilot is just the beginning. Your real education will come from the missions you fly, the aircraft you're assigned to, and the people who serve beside you. Sarah's final words to the class were delivered with the authority of hard-won experience. After the graduation ceremony, Sarah returned to her office and looked at the framed photograph of her crashed A-10 that now occupied a place of honor on her desk. Tail number 810964 was gone, but its legacy lived on through the pilots it had saved and the stories that would be told for generations to come. The aircraft had flown its last mission and completed its final task. It had passed the torch to a new generation of pilots who would carry forward its tradition of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to bringing everyone home. In the end, that was what mattered most in the brotherhood of military aviation. Not the aircraft themselves, but the lives they protected and the missions they made possible. Sarah picked up her phone and called Morrison at Nellis. When he answered, she had just one thing to say: "Thank you for telling me about my bird's history. It means more than you'll ever know."
The story of tail number 810964 had found its way home at last, carried by the F-16 pilots who had witnessed its final sacrifice and understood the significance of what they had seen. The circle was complete. The guardian angel had been properly honored, and its story would continue to inspire pilots for years to come. In the dangerous world of military aviation, there was no greater tribute than the knowledge that your sacrifice had meaning and would never be forgotten.